Shabbat Shalom. If you celebrate Hanukkah, Hanukkah Sameach. For people who are looking forward to Christmas, Merry Christmas. I know it's Christmas Eve, and many people have Christmas Eve plans, Christmas Day. Thank you so much for joining us. And for those who do not belong to one persuasion or another, thank you for joining in what I hope will be a really interesting philosophic approach to religion, spirituality, ethics, and then ultimately something I normally talk about on the Shabbat before Christmas, which is the First Century Judaism background of the emergence of Christianity. So I really appreciate your being here. I'm going to take a slow philosophic route. I'll give a brief presentation, and then I'll take time for questions. So one of the reasons that I want to offer this is reasons that I gave in the recent class I taught called All and Everything, which was a reteaching of a class I taught last year, which was named something similar. And that was take any questions people had about religion, philosophy, ethics, etc. But started from a basic philosophic viewpoint, and I'll share that starting point with you, and we'll break it down a little bit. Okay, that's the first thing I wanted to teach that. But here's my particular, what I'll say, the approximate starting point. Because I'm interested in the great debates, I see them on YouTube, sometimes Jordan Peterson versus Sam Harris. I like Jordan Peterson in his debates. Jordan Peterson and Roger Scruton, for example. A little bit not on the topic. I love Roger Scruton, by the way, Scruton. I think anything he does is brilliant. I watch YouTube where professors talk about Wittgenstein and Kant and others. They're of varying quality. But one thing that I see come up, especially with the skeptic and the atheist, they present religion in a very shallow, monochromatic kind of a caricature that they think they know what religion is about. They pick the most monochromatic, thin version, and then they proceed to put it down. Now, why does that concern me? I think for some people, even if they're, let's say, from an intellectual, skeptical perspective, their religion doesn't make sense. As long as a given religion doesn't teach violence, doesn't teach something that is immoral, we can talk about what that means in a moment. I don't believe we should ridicule other people's religions. I don't think we should make fun of them. I don't think we should talk a person out of their faith unless it causes some kind of palpable harm. And there are religions, or let's say aspects of religions, including Judaism, that teach things that could result in harm. Every religion, I think, has it. And then other kinds of what I'll call secular religions, I think mostly of Marxism and all of its descendants, that, again, I don't care what people believe as long as they're not going to do violence to other people, including the political violence of quashing free speech, which I think is a core human right. So I judge someone's beliefs by the effects of that belief, meaning while I don't think that religion is only about morality, I assess every religion by a moral standard, and we'll get to what that means in just a moment. So let's say there's a subgroup of people, like me and many of you, where we want to take religion seriously, although we're not dogmatic, we're not orthodox, we're not fundamentalists, but we know religion has something to teach us, but we're not trying to make a case for that to someone who's a skeptic, an atheist, etc. So I find that people who do want religion to mean something, either another person is challenging them, or some voice inside themselves is challenging them. And I don't think the challenge, whether it's from the outside or from the inside, is philosophically very deep. And I want to show you why that is. So instead of presenting what I think is one of the most futile debates imaginable, is the existence of God, yes, no on one side. The truth of religion, yes, no on one side. The truth of the Bible, yes on one side, no on the other side. I don't think it's a fruitful debate. So I never, ever engage in those debates because they're typically based on some kind of axiom. It's very hard to talk someone out of an axiom. And I don't even see why one should talk someone out of an axiom unless it's producing some kind of violence or violating, advocating violating some kind of human right. So if we want to take a long step backwards, when we say what's behind religion debates, what's behind does God exist and so forth, is the basic question called ontology. It's a Greek word, ontos means being, typically understood as a theory of what is. So if you want to think about religion, you want to think about God in a non-axiomatic, dogmatic way, which means it's a question for you. Doesn't matter what the Bible says, the Hebrew Bible, the New Testament, the Quran, any text you have. For some people, if the text says it, that's enough. The problem is no biblical text is coherent. Certainly the Hebrew Bible, the New Testament, I don't know enough about the Quran, but I've seen people, on YouTube present the problems with the Quran. So if you're not starting from a dogmatic perspective and you're going to take a step back, you can find logical fallacies, contradictions in any of what I'll call the main Western texts. And I find them, I don't know the text as well, but for example, someone advised me to read the Bhagavad Gita. There's a basic philosophical problem with that text. Many people find it quite beautiful. I've read them with the commentaries. But when I read the basic premise, right, the text did not attract me, even though it was literally quite beautiful. All right, so once one asks what is, there's a few existential commitments you have to make. So for example, now this might not sound very interesting to some of you, but one does have an existential commitment to make. Is there something called reality, or is everything an illusion? Now, some religious traditions believe that everything is an illusion, which means there is no reality. So the first thing is, do my senses detect something real? And I would say yes. So minimally what is real is our version of reality, which is of course limited by two things. First of all, our senses. We'll call it our five senses, our connection with the physical, empirical world, including perception, of course, feeling, touch, and so forth. So I will say that my senses are not lying. Now, however, even what I see is shaped by the limitations of vision. What I hear is shaped by the limitations of the auditory system. So what I see is probably not all that is. What I hear is probably not all that is. What I touch is not all that is, because I know, I'm pretty convinced there are molecules, there are atoms. But when I touch this book, I touch this table, I'm touching what I would call a human interpretation of what is. So we would call this a kind of an empirical humility, meaning I trust that things I see are real in the sense that I live in an external world. What I hear typically is real. What I touch is real, etc. But I realize I'm experiencing it within the limitations of human sense. That's number one. The second thing about what is would be the metaphysical realm. And there's no evidence for or against a metaphysical realm. It's probably the most important dogmatic statement I'll make at the beginning, which is a person who says, can you prove the metaphysical realm, most especially ethics, morals, justice, etc.? Can you prove that it exists by the test of empiricism? Of course not. You can't see it, you can't touch it, you can't measure it, you can't feel it. So there's no evidence that the metaphysical realm exists. But most people naturally function within the metaphysical realm of what I'll call the good, the just, etc. Another metaphysical realm is something called the truth. Now, empiricism, I studied logical positivism under the influence of Bertrand Russell, the early Wittgenstein, the whole school of thought, the Viennese Circle. It moved over to England, where they really tried to reduce all philosophy to mathematics and to very, very simple logical statements. And the problem is, as I studied this, it imploded because the things you can, as it were, state, purely logical, purely mathematical, are the most uninteresting things imaginable. So if I were to say this is an iPad, and we agree what an iPad is, and we spend, let's say, 20 minutes discoursing what this is, what an iPad is, then we come to the conclusion as a reasonable empirical statement. I don't think we need to do that. So when I would read the people who try to limit reality to what can be proven logically and mathematically, by the end of it, I thought to myself, I'm glad I know this. I hope I promptly forget it. Going back to my talk this morning, there are things I know that are not in my active knowledge because upon reflection, it was nice to study the philosophy of knowledge from an empirical mathematical perspective, not useful to me whatsoever. So even though that, I will say, for example, Bertrand Russell. One version of Bertrand Russell, A.J. Ayers and others, when they make a distinction between so-called science and religion, you get the sense that science is real, religion is superstition, mere opinion, and so forth. The problem is, of course, you look at someone like Bertrand Russell, he had very strong ethical convictions, very strong ethical convictions. And he wrote books on his ethical convictions. But at a certain point, when people asked Bertrand Russell to substantiate his ethical positions, he was brought into a kind of wonderment, a sense of moral confusion, because he couldn't base them on anything real. So on one hand, he says ethics, along with David Hume, Hume, that ethics really means what I like. The good is a matter of desire. This is Bertrand Russell along with Hume. So if you say, this is good government, all that means is I desire it. And if you desire another kind of government, that's your definition of the good, isn't all opinion. You can say that in a philosophy class. Nobody actually thinks that way. So a person might say, you have an opinion about what's right, I have an opinion about what's right, they're both equal. Nobody acts like they're equal. So I look at Bertrand Russell, for example. He said, it's all about desire. Good only refers to what I want. I try to universalize it. But when Bertrand Russell made his ethical stance, I'm just picking him as one notable figure that most of you have heard of or can look up easily. And probably, for me, the most notable in this chasm. On one hand, a great philosopher of logic, mathematics, understanding the empirical reasoning connection with reality. On the other hand, understood in his time to be a great humanitarian by some, a man profoundly devoted to ethics, but could never substantiate the ethics because the way he did philosophically substantiate ethics, the good means I desire it. When you look at his ethical stance, he didn't say, look, folks, I'm only calling this good because I desire it. It has no ontological understanding. There's no such thing as the good. Now, let me harangue you to agree with me. He would never start that way. He always started his works on ethics as in, morality and ethics is real. He had very strong opinions. He argued them as if they were utterly real, and if someone did not agree with him, they were immoral. I mean, I've seen videos of him from television shows. I've read some of him. There's no moral humility in what he says other than when he reflects on it. So I'm encouraging all of us to realize that even those who propound what I'll call a very limited ontology and epistemology, meaning what is and how we know, they limit what is to empirical. They limit how we know to mathematics and reasoning. And then people take that and they poke fun at religion and the Bible. But then if you look at the other side of their life, Sam Harris comes to mind. On one hand, if it's not empirical, if it's not the greatest good for the greatest number, which I think is a fallacy from beginning to end, just that concept, because it turns out the good is what is favored, which is not what the word good means. So the greatest good for the greatest number plays a trick, because when someone says that is good, they don't mean what is favored by a group of people, because obviously a group of people can want something that is not good for themselves, not good for everybody else. So that utilitarian argument gets away with a little bit of prestidigitation, a little magical trick, having something up their sleeve by using the word good but never defining it. And when they do get around to defining it, the idea just crumbles in their hands, which is why Greatest good for the greatest number sounds convenient. It's actually quite meaningless under investigation. If anybody wants me to substantiate that, I will. So, for those who say religion, ethics, truth, beauty, etc., cannot be substantiated, the same people do not live as if it can't be substantiated. As far as I know about Sam Harris, I read his book on morals. He believes that religion, ethics, etc., cannot be proven. It's kind of a nonsense language. He believes in utilitarianism, but then when I listen to his speeches, he has very strong opinions about how bad religion is, more or less quoting what Bertrand Russell said a couple of generations before. Religion is the cause of all that is bad. It's filled with superstitions, prescriptions for violence, etc., Bertrand Russell. And then there's been a history of secular atheists who are very hostile to religion. Why? Because religion is bad. Right? So then you say, well, what do you mean by bad? Well, it doesn't produce the greatest good for the greatest number. Does that seem reasonable when they say it's bad? That it's the root of all this violence. Well, I want to give a different point of view. Many years ago, under the invitation of Daniel Siegel, one of the my most admired neuropsychologists, he invited me to be in a symposium on spirituality and teenagers, spirituality and adolescence. So I took a chunk of my life and I studied about adolescence as deeply as I could, what adolescence is, what it's characterized by, and the spiritual inner life welfare, well-being of adolescence, how you measure it, morbidity, destructive behavior, and so forth. So on all the measures of adolescent well-being, there's one group that came out with the lowest drug and alcohol abuse, the lowest rates of violence, the lowest rates of promiscuity. We're going to assume those things don't lead to human thriving, are in some sense bad, and many other what are called morbidity indicators. You can imagine which group that was. People who went to church every Sunday, people who were part of the church youth group, people who had a positive relationship with moral exemplars beyond their parents, hopefully their parents, but beyond their parents, lived within a community of meaning that was rooted in virtuous teaching. So I remember being introduced to Sam Harris around the time I studied this, and I would say, if you want to ask what's the greatest good for the greatest number, at least in America, be a church-going Christian. It probably applies to Jewish life, meaning if a young person goes to synagogue every week, has a positive relationship with the adults, including their clergy, if they belong to the synagogue youth group, they're ensconced in a community. I don't know much about the religious sociology of Islam. I'm going to assume it's the same thing. So when we're to ask, what's the greatest good for the greatest number? Be religious. But of course, that just runs in the face of Bertrand Russell, Sam Harris. I'm going to see Bertrand Russell as the archetypal grandfather of all the modern skepticism, secular humanism, and atheism that is anti-religious. So just to sum this point up, when you ask what is, and someone says own the empirical, mathematical, natural science world, that's a critique, therefore, of the world of belief. Religion gets poked fun at. You look at the same people, they typically have very strong metaphysical opinions, especially about what the good is. So that's why I want to say at the starting of our conversation, and I repeated this many times in my All and Everything class, the most important decision a person has to make, I think, on anything, is there a moral reality? Now, most of us operate as if there is. When we talk to each other about what is right and wrong, if you have any come in contact with anybody who's errant, including children and teenagers, when you stand for any principle, when you think there's wrongdoing somewhere, in your family, at work, in the nation, anytime you have a conversation that people should behave better, including yourself, I believe you are indicating that there is a moral reality, meaning there are better and worse answers to moral questions that have to do with moral conduct, etc. Now, once I ontologically assume that there's a moral reality, a metaphysical reality in general, and for me that includes love, justice, truth, and beauty, all under a metaphysical concept of the good. I'm going to add the metaphysical concept of the holy, and I'm going to add the metaphysical concept of the divine. Now, I don't mean any of this in any kind of religious term. I don't mean the Jewish or not Jewish, Christian or not Jewish, Islamic not, Buddhist, Hindu. I'm not making any religious claim other than an experiential claim. I think every human being who's a thoughtful person with minimal intelligence has experience of love, justice, truth, and beauty, and they believe that these experiences, when they name them, accord with something real. And I'll back that up more up if I have to. I think even a person never thinks about the good. If a person were quizzed and would want to engage in a philosophic conversation, they would agree there's something called the good, meaning a life of goodness, a good relationship, a good job, maybe even in a moral sense, working for good people, being a good boss, living under good government. People take this world for granted, but when we take a step back philosophically, which means we're going to reflect on the idea, in a way, it's an existential commitment to the idea that there is good. There's no evidence one way or the other, but nearly every person operates as if there is something called the good. 4 aspects are love, justice, truth, and beauty. Now, why the holy? This is a subset of humanity, but I think across the globe, in every religion and non-religion, meaning you could be a skeptic of all of this and have a very deep experience of something that can only be called the holy. It might never happen in your life, but other people talk about it. It might happen a few times. It might happen many times. So as people talk about that sense of transcendence, in Celtic wisdom it's called thin places, where you're somewhere where you're touching on the metaphysical realm. You might have it in reading poetry, reading scripture, in a relationship with another person, an experience in the natural world, that the quality of experience shifts from day-to-day experience, where one might perceive love, justice, truth, and beauty, operate in the good, but then something shifts radically. One is in touch with the ground of being, the ground, as Paul Tillich would call this in his book, The Dynamics of Faith, the ultimate meaning, the ultimate ground of our meaning in a non-religious sense, meaning no religion, but I think the one thing that is foundational of religion. Now, no one can prove or disprove any of these things. I certainly can't. No one can. I'm going to appeal on the fact that we all operate as if these things are real. So arguing something from a William James, John Dewey point of view of pragmatism. If we operate as if they are real, just as if I operate in this material reality as if it's real, we're going to assume it's real so we can just move forward in the discussion. So ontology, what is a physical and a metaphysical realm? Metaphysically, love, justice, truth, and beauty, the good, the holy, even the divine. There are people that I know that belong to no religion, practice no religion, but they say, I have a strong sense of God in my life, particularly people, by the way, in 12-step programs. I don't belong to a religion, but I do have a strong sense of God in my life. So I would never want to argue a person out of that. Now, the next couple of things I want to talk about after I take a couple of questions is the question of epistemology. And why do I want to raise it? Because skeptics raise it. Skeptics will say, well, how do you know? If you believe there really is moral right or wrong, if you believe in a sense of the divine, you say you're making an ontological claim of what is. The next question is an epistemological claim. How do you know? And skeptics put, I'm going to now call the faithful, they push the faithful back on their heels. What do I mean by the faithful? I just need a word for those people who believe that there is a metaphysical realm that includes love, justice, truth, and beauty, the good, the holy, perhaps the divine. I don't have a better word for it. Now, faith means I believe it's real, although I cannot empirically prove it. We might call that faith. So, by the way, if you believe these things are real, but you don't belong to a religion and you don't like the word faithful, I apologize. You got a better word for me. I'm happy to take it. And the second thing I mean faithful is the original meaning of faith, which is live in fidelity to. Live in fidelity to. So, a faithful servant doesn't mean the servant believes in something, but can be relied upon. By the way, it works in Hebrew and in English and in Latin languages, Germanic languages. So, by faith, I mean I believe in that metaphysical world, and I will act accordingly. And if we can personify that metaphysical realm, you might say, again, clearly I'm talking about a sense of a reflective divine, that the divine, as it were, can have faith in me. I'm reliable. Okay? I'm reliable to try to live my life according to that metaphysical realm. I'm not saying I'm able to practice that all times and all places, certainly have my failures as a human being, but that's my commitment to live in faith with that metaphysical world. So what there is, I'm proposing what is, at least two realms. I'm proposing the two oppositional groups that you might say is the complete skeptic and a person that in some sense lives with faith that realm exists. So how is it that we know? This is a fascinating question. So I don't want to talk about empirical knowledge, mathematical knowledge, natural science knowledge, logical knowledge, and so forth. There's been so much done on that. I do want to speak briefly to the so-called standard versus what I know. So the standard is oftentimes mathematics, physics, chemistry, etc. That's oftentimes the standard of what we know. And then values, metaphysics, is something that is shaky, that we really can't know it. As you might know, one of the things I'm very interested in is the history of science, is the history of what we know. By the way, as I think his name is Neil deGrasse Tyson, a famous scientist. If I'm not mistaken, I heard one of his talks where he said on December 25th, we shouldn't discuss the birthday of Jesus because that's just all superstitious nonsense. We should talk about the birthday of Isaac Newton. Anybody hear him say that? Did I make that up or did he really say that? Okay, I think I heard him say it. So of course you look at Isaac Newton, and Isaac Newton was a theologian. Isaac Newton believed in God. Isaac Newton, as far as we know, at least studied the Kabbalah to some degree. Okay? So Isaac Newton had a very deep sense that when he studied physics, he was studying the mind of God. Now, I cannot believe that deGrasse Tyson didn't know that, so it might just been a rhetorical flourish. Now I'm going to go a little bit further. Up until, I don't know at what point, science was identified with atheism, but all through the 18th, 19th century, most scientists said, we're studying the workings of an orderly universe that could only have been produced by an intelligence, at least metaphorically, not like our intelligence. Now, I've heard that throughout. As I've been preparing for this talk for about the past month, by the way, I finally found the root of the quote that says something like this. The idea that our universe, with its mathematical laws, and they're still being discovered as we talk. I have a Google feed on science, and new things are discovered every time. Not created, by the way, discovered. That this universe could have happened randomly is like a 747, a hurricane, a tornado going through a junkyard and producing a fully functioning 747. It's a great metaphor. But I think our universe is even... it's so infinitesimally possible that it's random that I'm just going to say it's zero, which is actually not a calculation. Now, there are scientists who want to argue against an intelligence, and when they say, how'd the order get here? They just don't have an answer. But Einstein remember, said God does not play dice with the universe. There are many, many scientists, while they may not believe in religion, they're so profoundly moved by the beautiful order of the universe. And that's one thing I'm picking up from studying the history of science, the discovery of the periodic table, the arrangement of molecules, the discovery of atoms, quantum mechanics, every level that I study. One thing you see with the scholars is a sense of beauty. And for those with any spiritual sensibility, we're peering into the mind of God. When people said they discovered the God particle and so forth, people say, well, not exactly. What they mean by not exactly, not the Judeo-Christian God or the Western God or some other God, but a randomness in the universe that if it did not have intention, the universe would fall apart. This is my inference of what I'm studying. And therefore, there is some intentionality so that the randomness at the subatomic level does not pull the universe apart. Something is anti-entropy. There's some anti-entropic force in the universe. So I don't put science here and values here. I put science, as it used to be understood in the Middle Ages, as discovering the mind of God, and many scientists believe that. Fewer than in the past, but I think many, along with metaphysics and values, peering into the mind of God. So I think science and what you might call the investigation of metaphysics, which is mostly conducted by some professional philosophers, although it's very out of vogue, by the way. I don't think any professional philosopher today could be interested in metaphysics because it is just not acceptable in today's academy. But let's say certainly the books that I read, they're both interested in peering beyond, you might say, this level of reality. Physicists, mathematicians, quantum physicists, they're all moving toward, as it were, the nature of reality that is not immediately empirically verifiable. And many have an ongoing sense of the profound orderliness and therefore intelligence behind the universe, as is those interested in metaphysical reflection. So what do we both have in common? As Houston Smith said in his book, Why Religion Matters, I probably read this book every 3 years. It's not the best book on religion, but it's certainly a convenient a book on religion, where he ends the book with the metaphor of light. Those interested in metaphysics and in religion have a sense of their, as it says in Psalm 119, enlighten my eyes. So there's a sense of inner enlightenment where one knows the truth of things, the truth about oneself, the truth of the righteous path, the truth of the divine. So at least I know in English and in the Hebrew Bible, and I read enough poetry in German and Spanish, I think it works the same way there, that the idea of light has a metaphysical dimension. And so of course in the Bible, it says God created light on the first day, sun, moon, and stars on the fourth day. So many biblically faith-oriented, those who are interested in values, metaphysics, and so forth, point to that. There is a light that is not the physical light. You go to the side of, let's say, quantum physics, it's all rooted in light ever since Einstein came up with the formula that energy equals mass times the speed of light squared. I mean, the speed of light is, you might say, inherent in everything. So, of course, when the two groups talk, when God said, when the Bible has God saying, let there be light, for those in that conversation, that's what this means. The orderly property of the universe, which is an expression of the mind of God. So two different, you might say, I don't think they're oppositional, two different paths lead to what Houston Smith calls light. So what is it that knows this? It's not reasoning. It's prior to reasoning. It's not empiricism. It's not logic. It's not mathematics. What is this knowledge? And I don't know any other way to express this knowledge because it feels like knowledge. It feels like something that I know. I'm going to call it, let's say from a epistemological perspective, tacit knowledge, which means knowledge that I have unconsciously that helps me lead my life, about which I can reason. So we all work with tacit knowledge. We start with tacit knowledge. You might say unconscious knowledge that only has to be conscious when we reflect. So that's more of a psychological, philosophic term. Now I'm going to move into religious terminology. And why? Because I find religious terminology really helpful. The religious terminology I want to use, unsurprisingly, are soul and spirit. Soul and spirit. So when people say, how do I know about light as the metaphor that combines values and quantum mechanics, let's say, is soul spirit knowledge, a kind of tacit knowledge that the more I reflect, my life is based on tacit knowledge about values. Certainly tacit knowledge, I mean, I'm not an active scientist, although I, of course, like to read that. My life is much more connected with values. My values begin as tacit knowledge or soul knowledge. I use my mind to reflect on something that I know to be true. So I didn't reflect on whether there is justice. I've known there is justice since I was a child. I mean, I knew what the word fair and just meant. Never occurred to me they might not refer to anything. And as I've grown, I've just reflected on those words. And, and when I discovered in the Kabbalah, love, justice, truth, and beauty, as you know, that was a kind of a transcendent moment for me. But I gave knowledge to something that I knew at the soul spirit dimension. So if you're following my train of thought here, when someone says, how do you know? Well, there is a part of us, the values dimension, that is known as tacit knowledge in soul and spirit, that is delivered up to us about which we reason. And that's why you can't prove justice or fairness or the good, because we don't arrive at it through reasoning. So what happens, this is one thing I studied in graduate school, when you try to define the right, you're going to always involve the word good. When you try to define the word good, it always involves the word right. So people would say, well, then it's logical nonsense because the definitions employ this other word, so it's a kind of circular. That's not what I took away from that argument, other than the right and the good are, you might say, a kind of tacit knowledge that every functioning human being has. Now, some of us get it terribly wrong, by the way, that's clear. We'll talk about that in a moment. But how do we know? It's tacit, spiritual, soul knowledge. It cannot be proved in reasoning because we don't arrive at it through reasoning. We sharpen it through reasoning. And I would say sometimes when a person reasons about it, they can be reasoned into experiencing the tacit knowledge. So the reasoning doesn't prove that it exists. The reasoning connects them to it. Okay, that's the claim of my second paragraph of thought. Okay, any questions about that? And I'll try to move along and get to religion as quickly as I can. Any questions on any of that? The idea of how do we know? Tacit knowledge, knowledge known by the soul spirit, about which we can reason, but we don't arrive at it through reasoning. Therefore, when someone says, can you prove it? You say, you want me to reason about it? I don't know it from reason. I know it from soul spirit. They say, how do you know soul spirit exists? Tacit knowledge. It cannot be proven to a skeptic. I believe that every person runs their life on this tacit knowledge, whether they agree to that or not. And again, my evidence, I'm going to go back to Bertrand Russell. Bertrand Russell had profound ethical commitments. But I don't agree with many of them, by the way. But one cannot doubt that he was invested in ethics and the moral life. When asked to substantiate it, he could not. I would have said to him, it's soul spirit knowledge, which he would have utterly rejected. I don't have another name for it. How Bertrand Russell, the leading mathematician and scholar of logic in his time, and some people say one of the greatest ever, that his most profound human commitments were rooted in something that he could not explain through all of his massive knowledge in logic and mathematics. Therefore, if he had a better word for it, I'd love to know it. If you have a better word for it, I'd love to know it. But I'm calling it tacit knowledge known in what I'm going to call the soul-spirit continuum. Okay? Any questions about that? Okay, I hope you're with me, and I hope you find this meaningful. We're going to put an edited version up on YouTube, so maybe other people will find this of value. Okay, so now I'm going to take a long jump into what religion is. So remember, I'm not one of those who when I did my undergraduate and doctorate in religion, we didn't study comparative religion. You might say we studied this thing called religion. And when we study what constitutes a religion, here are some commonalities. There's commonly a myth or a text. Now, we know that ancient religions had myths. We're not sure how they were taught. We're not sure how much they subscribed to it. We're not sure if people took it literally, if it actually governed their lives, or whether they are works of literature written as poetry for poetic value. None of us really know how ancient myths were experienced. We know that they existed from textual records. We don't know what it meant to people. So when people talk about a religion, they typically mean some kind of inherited tradition. Okay, we'll call it the canon, C-O-N-O-N. Some textual tradition, for lack of a better term, that's transmitted by the authorized interpreters of the text. Nearly every tradition has people that are, as it were, authorized, either by community consensus or ordination or something else, to teach the text. To a community of the faithful, those whose lives are connected to the canon. It oftentimes involves guidance through the cycle of life, birth, maturity, sometimes marriage, sometimes raising of children, certainly death. Typically, religions have some articulation of those kinds of things. So there's a textual background, there's a community background, there's a ritual background, there's a point of view about life, a Weltanschauung, a point of view of how things are, and dealing with the most existential parts of our lives. So for me, let's say from a scholar of religion point of view, that's what a religion is. Now, there are many people when they say not religious, it means they don't have that. So secular means I might go to a Passover Seder, I might search for Easter eggs, I get presents under the Christmas tree. So I have, you might say, minimal contact with religion. I want to give you an example I learned from Carl Jung. If a person from, a Martian landed and wanted to understand Christianity, and what they got was a Christmas tree, presents, and the Easter egg bunny, would they understand Christianity? Right. Or if you wanted to understand Judaism, and you just pop into a Passover Seder and only look at the food, and people saying, when can we eat? Okay, they said, well, is that what it is? Ignore the text. Everybody's hungry, complaining about when they eat. Okay, is that what Judaism is? Maybe. Maybe for some people that's really is what Judaism is. Ignore the text and focus on the food. But you see, so when the Martian lands and says, I'm not quite getting it, but they believe in it, the meaning, the interior meaning of the religion cannot be communicated by saying, read the Bible, read the New Testament, read the Quran, read the Bhagavad Gita. There's something developed, which is my next big category of knowledge, which is really profound. In fact, I have open on my iPad categories of knowledge, going back to Aristotle, up through Kant, up through Husserl, and many different ones. And when you get to the modern categories of knowledge, a very big one is meaning. What does it mean to mean something? What does it mean to write something with meaning? What does it mean to mean something for the other person? What does it mean for the other person to say, this is what it means to me? Is there a connection between the authorial meaning intention and the receiver meaning. What does it mean to have a communal meaning? When I was in graduate school, this was called hermeneutics, which was the interpretation of meaning. And I came out of that with every other word was a $6 word, phenomenology, and a whole list of other words that I used a bit too freely. I've learned how to use the simple definitions of those words. But when you get into theory of meaning or hermeneutics, that in a way is the science that contains every other area of knowledge, which is how do we know what things mean? For example, if someone says, someone walks up to me and says, "Oh, you're a rabbi." I've had this before. I say, yes. They say, "So you believe in the Bible?" Now, that's not what they mean. What they mean is you're a fool. Okay, so I know what's up because I've had this conversation before. I said, after a manner of speaking, what do you mean? Get to your point. Well, do you actually believe that the Red Reed Sea parted? I don't know why, but all the secular atheists know this story very well. And the Israelites walked through and the Egyptians drowned. I said, do I believe it to be true? I said, it's implausible, but I wasn't there. I'm appealing to empiricism. Well, I think it's foolish. So, okay. Well, why would a smart man like you believe in foolish things? So notice their meaning. Their meaning is they can pull a few things out of the Bible, miracle stories, put all of religion under the miracle story, call it foolishness, and then ask me why I am a fool. Now, so when I look at this conversation, none of what is meant is being said. None of what is meant is being said. They're not really interested in why. They're not interested in my spiritual autobiography that brought me to a text that I rely on for spiritual depth, even though there are implausible things in the text. That doesn't, for me, no, number one, it doesn't cause me to have to prove them or to say, no, it's the word of God, it must have happened, because I don't believe that the Bible is mostly interested in history. There's some history. I don't think that's the goal of the Bible. So if they say, well, how can you not believe it happens in the Bible? Because I don't think the Bible is about history. I don't think that's what it's trying to teach me. It's teaching something else. Now, you've heard me go into this discussion on many, many levels. I want to bring this back to one thing that religion is a community of meaning. Those without religion typically don't have ongoing communities of meaning unless they have an exceptional book club, philosophy club, or something else. Now, I may be wrong with this, and I would love to be proven wrong, but I fear that people without some kind of religion affiliation in the Western world, if it's not going to be one of the religions, it's going to be very rare and sparsely attended. Not that religious institutions are that well attended, but I think if I were to walk into it, the ones that I know best, if I were to walk into a church or synagogue, it's a world of meaning. It's a world of tacit knowledge. And I'm going to assume when I walk into a room of 100 people, there's a large group of people that are not connected. There's a larger group of people that are connected but not very reflective. There's a small group of people that are deeply invested in reflective, and that's probably the group I'm going to join, let's say, after services or at the Bible study or something. But there is a community of meaning. People are showing up. There's a text at hand. Someone will interpret the text and apply that on what we believe as an introduction to what we ought to do. And we do it week after week after week. So what is religion? A community of meaning. Now, if you are in a dogmatic, evangelical, orthodox community, there are certain dogmatic statements with which you must concur to be a member. Okay, so I remember I was in the yeshiva world for a long time until I couldn't be, because I couldn't believe in the organizing dogma is that the Torah, the written Torah, and the oral Torah are God's word and will and are not to be doubted. That's an incoherent statement to me because the texts don't present themselves as being God's word. The Talmud does not present itself as being God's word. The Torah does not present itself as being God's word. That's clear in the interpretation of the faith community. I don't believe it's a particularly healthy interpretation, but very healthy people believe in it. And that's the foundation of their ongoing faith community. The faith community that I'm a part of, especially our congregation, I think there's nothing like our congregation, our axiomatic commitment is not rooted in a dogmatic statement as the inerrancy of the text, that the text is in some way authored by the divine, and it requires complete fideistic commitment. So I'm not in that world. So my foundational commitments to be in, let's say, our world, I think we're kind of unique, but there are many other places that have a non-orthodox, non-fundamentalist, strong community of meaning. And we might even share the same axioms. What would be interesting for me if there were some kind of organization of what I'll call non-fundamentalist, deep meaning faith. It would be interesting to see what other groups, other religions, other synagogues are doing, and find out what we're all thinking. That would be an interesting thing. So when I say religion, I don't mean dogmatic. I don't like the idea that the Orthodox, the fundamentalists, the evangelicals, that they've taken over what the word religion means. And how do I know? Because the Sam Harris types, that's all they talk about. And so whenever Sam Harris has talked with one of people not of that persuasion, he says, well, you're not really religious. So Sam Harris, for all his great qualities, excuse me for the sarcasm, he also knows exactly what religion is and isn't. Wow, that's great. Having never studied it in his life, obviously. Okay, I'm poking fun at Sam Harris, so maybe he'll come after me and he and I will have a debate. In any case, although it's maybe a dominant voice in religion, I don't think for me it is the voice that I listen to. When I think of religion in the sense of text, community, interpretation, way of life, giving shape and meaning to our life in a mythic symbol system with narratives and so many other cultural dimensions. For me, my commitment to it doesn't rely on the dogmas of the inerrancy of the text, that the text is authored by God and so forth. I know that it's there. It's not persuasive to me, yet I consider myself a very religious person and a very religious Jew. Okay? So that's my interpretation of religion and clearly my interpretation of the Judaism that I practice. First Century Judaism. So if you want to understand Christianity, you want to understand what I'm going to call, quote unquote, call Christmas, you have to understand first century Judaism. So I'll try to do this as efficiently as I can. At a certain point, what we call the Hebrew Bible, meaning the 5 books of Moses, the books of history, Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings, the books of prophecy, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, the 12 minor prophets, lumped together in what are called the historical prophets and the literary prophets, second part of the Bible. Third part of the Bible, they call the writings, which is Psalms, Proverbs, Job, the 5 scrolls, Daniel, Chronicles, and Ezra, Nehemiah, although that might be reversed. I was just studying this today. I believe it's Ezra, Nehemiah, and Chronicles is the very, I'm sure now. Okay, so that came together over hundreds of years from an academic perspective. There was the Judeans were exiled from their land in 586 by the Babylonians. Sometime during that exile, under the Babylonians, the text began to come together. That's clear. They were restored to their land by King Cyrus of Persia. The text continues to come together. And there's a certain point in history where the 5 books of Moses became canonical. We don't know exactly who wrote them, when, why, how they became canonical. We might have some knowledge of who wrote some of the history. Even the books where, for example, Isaiah is the prophet, we don't know how they came into being. Did he write these things down and deliver these sermons? Did someone hear them? We don't really know for sure, although there's textual evidence. We don't really know who wrote Psalms. It's not all King David, that's clear. We don't know about Proverbs. We certainly don't know who wrote the book of Job. So throughout the Bible, there is just no sure authorship as far as I know. So whatever the canon was based on, it wasn't based on authorship. But the canon becomes together. one thing that happens during this time is the Bible came into being. Okay? Whatever it was, when this library was cobbled together and called the Bible. Probably the first 9 books, the 5 books of Moses, Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings, that was probably the first Bible. Then the question of which prophets deserve the inclusion in the canon. And then at the end were the different parts of the writings. There is serious debate on the scroll called the Song of Songs. And again, I think from a more dogmatic perspective, there's a sense that they all came with divine authorship. No disputes of canonicity were serious. From a more academic perspective, there were disputations, but in the end, something called the Bible was produced. What's in the Jewish Bible was under dispute in the first century. That's one thing you know about First Century Judaism. The actual contents of the Bible, at least the end part of the Bible, were still in dispute. We know that from our text. So one thing that happened into the first century, the Bible was coming together, almost finished. A second thing that happened during this time is part of this textual community, they relied on the text in order to produce the laws and norms of the society. Because when the text came together as the canon, it came with it, especially regarding the 5 books of Moses, as authored by God. We don't know when that decision was made. It's clearly not said in the Torah anywhere that this document called the 5 books of Moses is authored by God. It never says it anywhere. Somewhere that became the fideistic commitment of the faith community with no evidence for it whatsoever, except it became an organizing dogma. If you didn't believe that, you probably hightailed it out of there, or you just kept your mouth shut because you wanted to be part of the community. So there was no serious debate on that in first century Judaism. So the idea of authorship of God probably came into being along with the idea of the Bible. What's interesting for us to think that those are historical achievements, meaning how the text became a book, became the Bible, the order that it achieved, the basic meaning, authorship by God, and then what I'll call the secondary meaning is how to interpret the text. The main point of interpretation is what shall we do, meaning what is the law. So the laws of the Torah, at least ostensibly, govern the life of the faith community, both the legal law, we'll say the criminal law, civil law, etc., and norms as well. The law is mostly made its way into what's called the Mishnah and the Talmud, well, not completely, because there's a lot of non-legal material in both, and the normative side was expressed in Midrash. Those 2 texts had not yet come into being in the first century, but they were there in an embryonic form. Now, another thing we know about first century Judaism is that already, we had a comment this morning, the idea of the plurality of meanings was clearly there because that was not an invention of the writers of the Talmud and the Midrash. That probably has been included within. There is a Bible, it's authored by God, we're not sure what it means. Now, that is one of the most important things I can say about first century Judaism that continues to this day, which is in evidence every time we discuss Torah. We know we have a text. God might be involved in some way, although we don't really believe in exact divine authorship. We know there's a meaning, but it's a pluralistic meaning. It's an unstable meaning. The text is stable, the meaning is not stable. Now, we have a long history of textual interpreters. Not one of our legion of textual interpreters is the official interpretation. We don't have a Vatican. We don't have a Pope. We don't have a court of final appeal. What the text means, now remember, what does it mean to the faith community? What it means to the person is always up for the debate called Torah study. Now, that seems to clearly be part already of first century Judaism from the texts that we have that refer to first century Judaism. So here's my summary of the state of first century Judaism. There is a belief system what is to come to be rabbinic Judaism under the Pharisees. There's another group called the Sadducees that are more attached to the temple. I don't think they had a strong meaning commitment. The world of meaning was what are called the Prushim, which means the interpreters of the written law, the oral law, developing some kind of loose theological system, but with the idea that the meaning of the text is unstable. Okay? Now, if you only know the Pharisees from the New Testament, that doesn't sound like the Pharisees that you know. That's a very biased view of Pharisees. In the Jewish tradition, the Prushim, meaning the elders prior to the beginning of rabbinic Judaism, around the year 100, we call them Hachamenu Zichronam Livracha, our sages of blessed memory. We don't call them Pharisees, we call them Chazal. Hachamenu Zichronam Livracha. Okay, who are they? They're the Pharisees. That's not what we call them. We call them Hachamenu because the institution of rabbi was probably not established in a formal way until around the year 100. Now, after that, they are called Rabbeinu, Rabbanan, the rabbis. Before that, they're called Chazal. Now, in the Jewish tradition, all of the later rabbis are also folded under Chazal. So when I say the ancient rabbis, I'm trying to translate the word Chazal. So I have a book in Hebrew which is called Chazal Deotam Ve'emunatam. The ancient sages, all the way through to the to end of the Talmud, their viewpoints and their belief system. Chazal Deotam Ve'emunatam. All right, so the Chazal existed. There were Chachamim, including Hillel and Shammai. I mean, some of the greatest sages. Now, remember, they're not called rabbis. Hillel was not a rabbi. He was called a sage. They existed, we know, because of many texts, including the so-called Ethics of the Fathers. So we know that existed. We know that they oftentimes were known to work in pairs. We don't know how historical that is, but that's how the text presents them. And they had many different interpretations of what Torah meant. Now, I just want to add another thing, and that is a caricature of the beliefs of Chazal is the idea of value from observance of the mitzvot, meaning I'm only of value to the degree that I follow the commandments. By the way, the idea of 613 commandments is an artifice. We don't know if there are 613. Those who have enumerated them, their lists don't even agree. But we'll say there's some kind of finite body of the commandments, both ritual and moral. But included in them, when we look at liturgy, there's no belief that our merit before God is based on punctilious observance, because we have the Ahava Rabbah prayer, one of my favorite. Adonai, God, the Torah is evidence of your great love. That is one of the first prayers that we have in the Mishnah that is part of our service. So what we know of liturgy in the first century just denies the fact that it was a religion of minutia. That doesn't mean that there wasn't minutia, but the religion didn't reduce itself to minutia for anybody who was inside the tradition. Okay? Last thing I want to say, when we look at the Jesus as presented in the New Testament, first of all, he was not a rabbi because there were no rabbis. Jesus visits synagogues. He reads from Scripture. He reads from prophets. He quotes Scripture well. He says, love God with all your heart, soul, and might. He says, love your neighbor as yourself. There's nothing that Jesus says that I know of that disagrees with first century Judaism. So Jesus was an entirely Jewish figure from a first century Judaism perspective. He was in Judaism. Now, one can say there are things that he said that were not strictly in accord with what you might call normative first century Judaism. Did he see himself as a unique son of God? Perhaps, but that was not unique. In the Greek-speaking world, and this was an Aramaic and Greek-speaking environment, we'll call it the Greco-Roman world, there were other figures that were understood to be the emanated Son of God in that world. So it might have been unique in first century Judaism. I don't believe that it was. It was definitely not unique in the Mediterranean. I can another time I give you many examples. We have textual histories of people that were known to be the emanated Son of God, who came down to this realm and died a death in some way which was salvific. So was Jesus an anomaly? Well, probably not commonplace, but not something that no one had ever heard of. So when I study the New Testament, I'm talking about the Gospels here, and in some way the Acts of the Apostles being the history of the early church, that does seem to be first century Judaism. Where does Christianity differ? The letters of Paul. The letters of Paul, written somewhere in the 30s and 40s CE, maybe entirely the 40s, that creates what we call Christianity. What Paul teaches is not first century Judaism. It is the creation of a new religion. Jesus did not found Christianity. Paul did, sometime in the 40s, maybe the 50s. And then the Gospels, from an academic perspective, while they were in formation, there are many more than 4, by the way. We know that for sure. The Gospels were probably written in the 70s, 80s, and 90s CE. The New Testament wasn't fully formed and canonized until about 100 years later. And it was actually a process of canonization that went on at least another 100 years. So the summary of this is Christianity, Jesus was a thorough first century Judaism character. I think he fit into the culture. Paul was not. I think Paul's thought is much more an intersection of Greek and Hebrew thought. The text is organized, the New Testament begins to be organized by the end of the first century with the 4 Gospels and letters of Paul and letters of others. Revelation gets attached somewhere in there, but it's not canonical for another 100 years. Okay? Now, where Paul came from, which is a good question, maybe we can get there. So let me tie this all together from before. Let's say that the first century Judaism had everything I'm talking about. They had a text. It included a worldview of understanding the text, rituals to take people through life, institutions of meaning, some kind of belief system that had borders, but they were porous borders. They weren't definitive. There's no opportunity for dogma in first century Judaism because Judaism did not yet exist. It was full of schisms and different points of view. So we might say first century Judaism was Judaism in formation. Christianity emerged out of that, I think, based in the letters of Paul.